Hi, and welcome to Lesson 4, which is about line graphs. So as I mentioned earlier in the course, the essential task that you have when you look at a Task 1 academic question is deciding what type of data you're dealing with. So information in a map or a process, and if you're dealing with things like line graphs, pie charts, bar graphs, etc., deciding whether or not you're primarily dealing with changes over time or differences between categories or possibly both. So a line graph is obviously the one where the main information that you need to focus on is changes over time. And a lot of the trend vocabulary that you'll learn about increases and decreases is related to what you'll be describing in a line graph. So in the first few lessons of the course, I gave a kind of general overview of what you'll be doing in Task 1 and the types of things that you'll see. But really the best way to understand Task 1 academic questions is to go through specific examples in detail so that you can learn about the important things that you need to do. So introducing what the graph shows, giving an overview, and then dividing the data and giving specific details about the data. So what I'm going to do in this lesson and for the next 7 lessons is go into 1 or 2 questions, just looking at the question and talking about those important things, and then go over a detailed example, which is in the lesson notes on the website IELTScompass.com, and talk about that response and the features that you need to pay attention to. So before we have a look, the 3 things that you really need to think about are similar to writing task 2, an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, or in this case, a summary or an overview. Now, where you put these is slightly different. The introduction is essentially just a sentence that you take the information from the question, as I'll show you, and you introduce the topic that way by telling what the graph is about, or what the maps are about, or what the process is about. That's the first part. Then you've got your overview or summary. You can put that second, or you can put it last. Those are 2 very logical places to put it. As long as you put it anywhere, examiners are supposed to look for it, and if you have one, even if it's in a strange place, you should get credit for it. However, you don't want the examiner to miss it, and in terms of coherence and cohesion, putting it after the introduction or at the end are 2 logical places to put it that will aid coherence and cohesion. If you put it in the middle somewhere, it's a bit strange that you just randomly put your summary in the middle of a details paragraph. So that's something to keep in mind. So as I mentioned, it doesn't really matter where you put it. The rationale for putting it last is that it's the last thing the examiner is going to see. The rationale for putting it in the second paragraph is that the examiner is immediately going to recognize that you have written an overview. And that's important because the overview is so important. And if you don't write one, you won't get a good score. And also, like, examiners can go through marking lots of essays and not see very many overviews. So it's something they're definitely on the lookout for as soon as they start reading. So if you put it second, they'll see that. They'll know that you've got an overview. And I think that makes a good impression in terms of letting the examiner know early on that you know what you're doing. That's not a guarantee that you're going to get a fantastic score simply because it's second. It's just, I would put it there for the reason that examiners are looking for it. And if you give it to them early on, they'll focus more on your details paragraphs afterwards. In terms of how much detail you want to give in an overview, it's a general summary of what happens in the graph. So if I tell you the overview, you should have an idea about the most important things in the graph. It's sort of the general topic of the graph and what happens. If you go see a film and your friend says to you, "Oh, how was the film that you saw?" You say, "Oh, it's good." And they say, "What was it about?" They don't want all the details. So if you say something like, "Oh, it's about 2 people who met during the war and the problems that they had." That's a pretty clear overview of the type of film it's about. It's a film about the relationship between 2 people, problems that they had, and it's a war film. So that gives them a general idea of what it is. So they said, what was the film about? And you said, "Well, it was about these 2 people, and they both worked in a restaurant, in a cafe in Paris in the 1940s. And one of them was a waiter, and the other one worked in the kitchen. And the way that they met was," so that's like, it's, basically giving every detail from the beginning of the film. That's not what your friend is asking, right? They just want a general idea. So it's very similar when you give your overview. You're just explaining the major things that happened or the general context of the details that will appear later. As far as the details paragraph, generally 2 details paragraphs is a good idea because it shows the examiner that you can divide the data logically and that you can paragraph logically. Again, for coherence and cohesion in task 1, really good paragraphing isn't essential until you get to band 8. But if you do it this way, it will have a positive effect on your essay, even if you only need band 7. So give yourself every little bit of help that you can. This is an easy way to show how good you are at paragraphing. There's some flexibility about how you divide the information. It just needs to be logical and clear why you did that. So I'll go into that with each of the questions that I go over, and also when I go over the specific essay. One thing I noticed is, before I made this course, I had a really, really careful look at all of the questions in every single Cambridge book and the materials from the British Council, from IDP, to try to find as many principles of what an IELTS Task 1 question is that I could, because understanding that makes understanding what you need to do easier. And I was kind of surprised to find this, because when you see so many different types of graphical information, which are all very different, pie charts, bar charts, maps, diagrams, that there is this common theme about the details. Depending on how you count them and how you group the things together, there are approximately 8 to 12 bits of information that you need to talk about in your details paragraph. Now, I'm saying that to show you that there's a level of consistency between the question types, and like if you've got you'll see in the example on the website, there's a line graph with 2 lines, and I'm also going to go over a line graph with 6 lines. Now, the amount of stuff that you have to describe in your details paragraph is pretty much the same. Again, it's in this kind of range of 8 to 12. Now, that doesn't mean that you should always just be counting, and once you've got 8, you're fine. Or, if you've got 12, you'll be fine every single time. No, what you want to do is describe the relevant ones, and that will generally be in the range of 8 to 12. The way you can think about this number as a way to help you is, if you finished your essay and you've only described 5 points and your essay is 110 words long, that's telling you something. If every time you write an essay, you describe in detail 15 different points and you're running out of time and it takes you half an hour and you write 250 words, that's telling you something. You're not identifying the important ones, and you're not selecting the data correctly. If you go through all the data in a question and then you count up the points that you mentioned, 9, and there's nothing else that really seems relevant, then you're probably fine. So think about this as a kind of range. Approximately this much data is what you'll need to describe for every question. And if you keep that in mind, that should help you. And again, I'll talk about this as we go through the different types of question. So let's have a look at a Task 1 line graph question. So here we are. The graph below shows the proportion of the populations age 65 and over between 1940 and 2040 in 3 different countries. So that's your introduction. Saying that in a slightly different way. So, you could say something like, the line graph shows data for Japan, Sweden, and the USA in terms of portions of their populations age 65 over during a 100-year period between 1940 and 2040, something like that. Change it a bit, but don't try to change it beyond your ability to manipulate the language or use synonyms. Again, so synonyms can be proportion, portion. It can be things like 3 different countries, Japan, Sweden, and the USA, going into more detail. It can be a 100-year period instead of 1940 to 2040. Again, graph, line graph, but don't worry too much about this. So specifically, if we think about what we talk about, in terms of the overview and the details paragraph, let's come back to the overview a little bit later, but just think of, like, we've got 3 lines, and what's happening? Are they increasing, decreasing? If we look pretty clearly, everything is overall increasing. So that is one of the main points that we want to come up with in our overview. But of course, lots of things happen during this time that are also worth mentioning. So if you look at kind of this top line, the USA, maybe talking about this point here, that's one. Then this plateau, that's another. Then this increase, that's a third thing to talk about. If we look at Japan, this kind of period of decline slightly, that's one thing. So we're up to 4 bits of information, and then a period of slight incline, 5 bits of information, and then a very steep increase, 6, and then this part where the lines cross and Japan, which had previously been the lowest, is now the highest. That's certainly worth mentioning. So we're up to about 8 bits. If we look, Sweden, 9, or maybe even just, even all the way up to here. You didn't necessarily need to, you could mention that. Period of decline, 10, and more increase, 11. So again, depending on how you talked about this, you could go into a bit more detail about this period from 1940 to about 2020, where there are kind of starts and stops, or you could just mention it as an overall period of increase. You've got to describe the details in numbers. So the other thing to think about is the time. So it's 2020. Here we're going to be talking about the past, and here we're going to be talking about the future, so language of prediction. So Japan is expected to rapidly increase from 10 million in around 2030 up to 25 million in 2032, in approximately 2032, something like that, at which point it will be the country with the highest proportion of its population 65 and over, something like that. So that's worth mentioning, where this cross is. So Japan started out in the lowest and it ends up in the highest. So that's something you can mention as a specific detail, and you could include that in your overview. So essentially, your overview is basically that all 3 countries have seen an increase from 1940 until the present. That's true. And that all countries are also predicted to see an increase in the proportion of their population age 65 and over up until 2040. So that's basically 2 pieces of information. All countries have increased and are going to continue to increase, and then Japan, which began in the lowest position, is predicted to end the period in the highest position. So that's something that is important, notable. So like if you looked at the graph, that's one of the things that you notice, that okay, this line at the bottom, wow, it sort of starts out really low and then it goes up really fast. So again, that's something worth noticing and something that you need to describe. So in your overview. So overview is basically that piece of information about Japan, plus the fact that all 3 countries increased until the present and are forecast to continue to increase until 2040. So that's basically what you need to talk about. And again, those 9 or 10 bits of information of describing each piece of the graph, that's what you want to go to into your details paragraph. So in terms of how would you group this information, which paragraphs would you put each country in? Again, there's flexibility, but if you see an obvious way to group them, then do that. And in this case, the pretty obvious way is if you look at, Sweden and the USA, they're kind of similar looking, right? So talking about those in the same way, in the same paragraph, is logical, whereas Japan is the one where all sorts of sort of interesting stuff happens, and that would be worth putting that in its own body paragraph. So if you think about, if you put, theoretically you could put Japan and the USA in the same body paragraph, but like, what are the similarities? How would you describe those in a way that's logical, or in a way that's easy to keep it clear? So that's the thing, is that you've got to describe the line for Japan in a much different way. So putting that in its own paragraph would make that much more logical than putting them together. I've seen other people talk about, putting the line here and talking about the 3 countries, what happens in them up until the present, and then in the second paragraph talk about what's forecast for the future. That's also fine, as long as it's clear what you're doing. Again, if that's the way you think about it, and that makes it easier for you to keep the details straight in your mind and describe it in a way that's clear, then do that. So there is flexibility. Just look at it in a way that seems logical to you, and then think about it and think, like, can I describe this clearly, and is my description going to be easily understood by the examiner? Because that's really important. So here's another one where, in this case, you've got 6 lines, 6 categories, 6 types of power. So often when students see this one, they panic because, wow, there's 6 lines. Usually there's only 2 or 3 or 4. But if you look at the lines here, there's not as much happening as there was in the last one. So our introduction, the graph below gives information from a 2008 report about the consumption of energy in the USA since 1980 with projections until 2030. So it's quite common that all of what happens in the graph took place in the past, and there are no projections for the future. But these 2 examples have projections for the future. So again, that's something you need to think about. in terms of language you use and possibly how you organize. Saying this in a different way, paraphrasing, giving that type of information in a way that you can do clearly using language that you know well. Again, if your level of English is very high and you're good at paraphrasing, then you're going to be able to come up with something that's quite different. If your level of English is lower, don't try to make it different just to make it different, because what will happen is a lot of mistakes, and that's what you don't want if you need Band 7 or higher. Okay, in terms of our overview, that's, really what you need to think about is increases, decreases, what stayed the same, and stuff like that. So if you look at petrol overall, up, coal, up, natural gas. So, I mean, maybe a slight increase, but stayed about the same. We look at these three down here. This is what I meant by, you've got to mention nuclear, solar and wind power and hydropower, but you don't necessarily have to go into a lot of detail about each of them because they are doing approximately the same thing. And the amount of change that happens, so I mean, technically hydropower looks like it decreases a little bit. Solar and wind looks like it stays about the same, maybe increases. Nuclear looks like it increases a little bit, but basically from the beginning of the period to the end of the period, there's not much difference in those three things. So, your overview should maybe focus on 2 bits of information below and above. Petrol, oil, coal, and natural gas accounted for the majority of energy consumption, with coal, petrol, and oil increasing and natural gas remaining unchanged. So over the period again. Now there are some changes right here, blah, 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 blah. But what we want is over the whole period, what happens? It remains about the same from the beginning to the end. We'll go into this detail where these squiggles are later in the details paragraph. So that's part of your overview. The other part is, nuclear, solar, wind, and hydropower accounted for a very small percentage of energy consumed and remained approximately equal throughout the period. So that's not, approximately equal is a good way to describe this. So there are some small changes that we might mention when we get into the details paragraph, but a good way to describe this part of the graph as well, not much really happens. So there is some slight difference at the end as opposed to the beginning, but the numbers don't move much, and not a whole lot is happening there. So that's one way to think about your overview. So the ones that are the greatest source and the least source, and what happens within those 2 groups. So coal, petrol, and oil increase, natural gas stays about the same, nuclear, solar, wind, hydropower also stay about the same. Now, again, using this language of approximation, about, approximately, around, is important, because when you're giving a general statement, if you use those, then your statement will be accurate. But if I say, nuclear, solar, wind, and hydropower remained exactly the same, that's not accurate anymore, because you can see there is some small differentiation between those 3. Okay, so that's our overview. Let's think about how would we divide the data. So, one good way to do it would be here, the same way we divided our overview. So that's very logical. Talk about the ones that accounted for the greatest percentage of energy consumption and the ones that accounted for the least. Okay, so that would be 2 body paragraphs, right? 1, 2. In terms of the specific details, I mean, one thing we want to think about is time. All right, so we should mention something here and something here. We're going to use different language to do that. Again, this is another way that you could divide your details paragraph. So one talking about time up until now, and then predictions for the future. The reason I would do it the other way for this particular one is that you've got 6 different lines to mention, and so talking about them, splitting the time that way, and then talking in a continuous way about data from one point to the next can be difficult. But again, if you can do it and it's clear, that's not an issue. For me, I think that would be difficult, so I wouldn't do it that way. So if you think about the sort of data points. So for petrol, you might mention one here, the sort of period of up and down, then an increase here, and then a forecast increase there. There's 3. For coal, if you look at this little bit, is that really worth mentioning? Probably not. So for coal, you know, I would have 1, 2. So here we've got 3 bits, 2 bits. Natural gas, plateau, that's something you would, this period of, you know, where things flatten out, that's something that you need to talk about. And then you might talk about, and then, you know, you might talk about this and this. So there's 3 more. If we look at these 3, this is a good example of where you can kind of talk about 3 in the same way. So nuclear, solar, wind, and hydropower all started out around 3 quadrillion units and changed little over up until now. And then, you know, nuclear and solar wind are forecast to increase slightly in the future, where hydropower is expected to remain unchanged, something like that. So that's kind of 1 long sentences or 2 shorter sentences to describe this bit. So again, there's 3 bits of information. 11. So again, don't set out to come up with a number, but if you just look for the useful pieces of information that you need to describe, then you'll generally get this number between 8 and 12. And you can see the last one, I think we had around 10, and there were only 3 lines. This one, there's 6 lines. We've still only got around the same amount of information that we're discussing. So that's something really important to keep in mind. And again, just remember, to get above band 5, you've got to use these units, right, with the time. So increased, so if I just want to describe this all in one, petrol and oil all in one, I could say began at 35 quadrillion units in 1980 and increased to approximately 40 quadrillion units in the present day, and is expected to further increase to 45 trillion units in the future, or until 2030, something like that. So again, using units like this in your details paragraph, using data with figures and or numbers is extremely important. Okay, so if you go to the website, or if you're on the website, just look underneath the video, and this is the information that you'll see. Or you can find it later, but I'm going to go over this now. So this is a question. You can see this one's got 2 lines, but there's all sorts of things happening, a lot more happening and a lot more to describe in each of these lines. So again, this is 2. Previously we saw 3 and 6, but the amount of information that you need to talk about is approximately the same. What does the graph show? Radio and television audiences through the day in 1982. So this is in the past. Like I mentioned, not all of them talk about the future. And the time that you're talking about is not a single year, but the time over the course of the day. So if you look at the bottom of the graph, 6 a.m., 8 a.m., 10 a.m., noon, etc. So the times of the day and the percent of the population over 4 years old watching or listening to TV. Now, this is a good example of one where it seems like it would be very easy to explain why this is happening, why what's happening in the graph is happening. So if you look at the dotted line for radio, early in the morning, the number increases, and then starting mid-morning, it decreases throughout the day. And if you look at the sort of dashed line for television, it's quite low until the afternoon, and then peaks in the evening, and then falls off at night. So I've read more than one student response to this question where they said the number of listeners to radio is high in the morning and then decreases throughout the day, and the number of television viewers is low in the morning and increases late in the day, because when people are driving to work, they're listening to the radio. And when they come home from work, they generally watch television. And then as they go to bed, the number of television viewers falls off sharply. Now, that's probably true. That makes sense for sure. But there's nothing about that in the graph. That information does not appear anywhere. And since you're not supposed to interpret the information in the graph or explain the information in the graph, you're only supposed to describe it. If you do something like that, regardless of whether you're exactly correct or not in real life, you will be penalized for it. So don't give any sort of commentary, explanation, opinion about what you see. Simply describe the information. Okay? So I think probably the easiest thing to do is just to look at how this was done, or how I did this. So the line graph shows diurnal variation in the number of radio listeners and television viewers in the United Kingdom aged 4 and over in 1992. So I'm essentially just given the same information from the question. Throughout the day, diurnal means throughout the day. Again, you've probably never seen that word before. I remember learning this word when I was in high school, so that was more than 30 years ago. This is probably the first time I've ever used it because it is appropriate for this situation. But again, it's a word that you probably wouldn't use. Daily is an absolutely fine word. Daily variation in the number. So again, like, keep in mind that you use the English that you know to describe what you see correctly and clearly. And for me, I happen to think, oh, that's a good word. I can use that, and I know how to use it, so I'm going to use it. But like I said, it's a little bit better than daily. It will definitely, the examiner will definitely notice it, but it's not required. It's not going to add a lot to my score. You know, if anything, it's just a word that I use to describe the situation, where daily would also be fine and is not included in the question. So the question says throughout the day, you could say daily. So keep those things in mind. Don't rush to scribble down the word diurnal thinking it's going to help you in your score. Probably won't. Okay, so there I've described what we can see. Oh, it's 1992, not 1982. So overall, the number of radio listeners peaked in the morning, then declined throughout the day. So if we look at, so it goes up until about 10 a.m. and then it goes down for the rest of the day from around, well, 8 a.m., 9 a.m. It's the peak, and goes down for the rest of the day. So that's radio listeners, while the number of TV viewers climbed throughout the day, falling off only late in the evening. So again, if you look at that, you can see TV viewers starting out at around 0 early in the morning and reaching a high point around 8 p.m. and then falling off throughout the evening. So that's basically what happened. Those main shapes, so those two peaks is what I've described and what happens before them and after them. So there's our overview. So if we go back and look at the different points that I'm going to talk about. So if you look at those two lines, how many different things do you see that you could mention? So I can see listeners, you know, from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., that's worth mentioning, possibly from 8 a.m. to around 2 p.m. Again, this little bump at around 4 p.m. where it goes back up, that's possible, could mention that. And then, you know, the kind of period from around 6 p.m. to around 2 a.m. where it's declining steadily and then starting to go back up early in the morning. So there's about 5 or 6 bits of information I can include there. For TV, 6 a.m. in the morning, there's a little bump. Then up until around noon, it's increasing, and then it's increasing quite steeply from around, you know, early afternoon, 2 p.m. until around 8 p.m. when it reaches the peak, and then it declines again till around 2 a.m. and, you know, remains kind of flat. So again, 4, 5, 6 pieces of information for each one. So let's have a look at that. Radio audiences comprise around 6% of the population at 6 a.m. and rose sharply to a peak of nearly 30% around 8 a.m. From this point, the figure declined steadily throughout the day, with the exception of a brief, slight increase in the late afternoon, and fell to a low point of approximately 1% at around 2 a.m. The number of listeners remained stable until just before 6 a.m. when it began to climb again. So how many bits of information have I mentioned there? 6%, 30%, that's 2. Declining steadily, that's 3. Brief slight increase, that's 4. Low point, that's 5. Remaining stable and climb again, that's basically 6. So again, I'm not trying to get you to focus on counting the specific numbers of pieces of information, but rather to focus on the kind of overall amount of information that you need to discuss when you're doing a question like this. So the second paragraph, television viewers, in contrast, began the day at 0 and then recorded a series of gradual increases until the late afternoon, when approximately 20% of the population was watching television. At this point, viewership spiked to nearly 50% at around 8 p.m. and then falling 8 p.m., then falling precipitously from around 10 p.m. and tapering off at about 2% at roughly 3 a.m. So if you look at the number of pieces of information I included there to completely describe all the important information, began at 0, had a series of gradual increases. There's one. Approximately 20% of the population was watching television. There's 2. At this point, viewership spiked to 50% around 8 p.m. There's 3. And then falling precipitously from around 10 p.m. There's 4, tapering off at 2% at roughly 3 a.m. So 5. So again, 5 there, 4, 5, 6, depending on how you count them, 4, 5, 6 for the other one, depending on how you count them. The total number of data that you describe is approximately equal for each question. And I think that you can see that I've described the main features of the graph and done that in numbers. So one example, if you look at the paragraph on television viewers, so began the day at 0, there's a number, recorded a series of gradual increases until the late afternoon. So I haven't given figures for that, when approximately 20% of the population was watching television. So I've given you the specific figures of starting at 0 until the late afternoon when approximately 20%. And they did that, the way they got from 0 to 20 was a series of gradual increases. So again, you don't have to use numbers for every single point, but use them consistently and clearly to give a clear picture of what's presented in the graph. Okay, so if you look below, I'm not going to go over all of this, but if you look at the second version below, you'll see some important words and phrases highlighted. So cohesive devices are in green, referencing devices are in orange, and less common or useful vocabulary is in either blue or purple, depending on how many bits are in a sentence. So cohesive devices, overall for our overview, you need one there for your overview, overall, in summary, something like that. And then if you look in contrast. So that's all I've got. That's all that's necessary for this one. So I'm essentially stating that there's a transition signal. In contrast, the television viewers is going to be a different type of information. Overall, I'm telling you here what the summary of the information is. You don't really need other types of cohesive devices. If you look at the referencing devices, those kind of function a little bit as a cohesive device in a way, in explaining where you are and making it clear what you're talking about. But a referencing device is essentially talking about something that you've already mentioned and making it clear that that's what you're talking about. So if you look at radio audiences, the third paragraph, the first details paragraph, radio audiences composed around 6% of the UK's population and rose sharply to a peak of nearly 30% at around 8 a.m. From this point, so at what point? From 8 a.m., right? So rather than saying at 8 a.m., I'm a different way to say that. So that's making it clear what I'm talking about. That's what a referencing device does. In the last paragraph, let's see, television viewers in contrast began the day at 0 and then recorded a series of gradual increases until the late afternoon when approximately 20% of the population was watching television. At this point, viewership spiked. So at this point, when? The late afternoon, okay? So often in task 1, you won't have a lot of cohesive devices or a lot of referencing devices just from the way that the data is described, but you probably will have a couple. And referencing devices, for sure, you probably use them well without thinking about them. But if you get feedback on your task 1 essays, which you should confirm that you don't have any issues with referencing devices, because if you do, you could have a problem. That's something examiners are looking for at band 7 and higher. And then the other thing is about the number of cohesive devices. So you probably won't use a lot. I'm not saying 2 is the magic number, but if you've got every single sentence starting with a cohesive device, especially in task 1, that's a problem, because it's just overuse and it's not necessary. You should only use them for transitioning, signaling that you're going to talk about something important like an overview or talk about different information. Okay, so there you have a detailed discussion of what a line graph question is, what it includes, and what kind of information that you need to include when you write your report. So make sure you practice a wide variety of line graph questions when you're preparing for the test, and keep those points in mind as you're practicing in the various situations that you'll be presented with. If you do that, by the time you get to the test, you should do great.